In the early 16th century, Ethiopia faced one of its gravest threats when the Muslim Sultanate of Idel, under the leadership of Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, also known as Ahmad Gragn or Ahmad the Left-Handed, launched a massive invasion of the Ethiopian Empire. This conflict, known as the Ethiopian Idel War, raged from the 1520s to the early 1540s. Ahmad Gragn's forces were highly organized, battle-hardened, and armed with firearms, which gave them a devastating advantage over the traditionally equipped Ethiopian forces. Emperor Lebna Dengel of Ethiopia, caught off guard and overwhelmed by the ferocity and technological edge of Ahmad's campaign, appealed to Christian powers in Europe for help. The strongest response came from Portugal, which was then expanding its influence across the Indian Ocean and maintaining a colonial presence in Goa and along the East African coast. Portugal viewed Ethiopia as a valuable Christian ally in a largely Muslim region, and also as a potential strategic partner against the growing influence of the Ottoman Empire, which supported Ahmad Gragn in 1541. A small but well-trained Portuguese expedition of about 400 musketeers, under the command of Cristóvão da Gama, the son of the famed explorer Vasco da Gama, landed at the Red Sea port of Massawa. Their mission was to reinforce the embattled Ethiopian Empire with modern firearms and tactics. These men brought with them arquebuses, early firearms, cannons, and military discipline that contrasted sharply with the more traditional warfare of the region. Initially, the Portuguese contingent was successful in repelling Adelite advances and restoring morale among the Ethiopian troops. Cristóvão da Gama quickly became a key figure in the conflict. He joined forces with the Ethiopian royal family, including the future Emperor Gelidus, and launched a series of engagements against Ahmad Gragn's army. Though the Portuguese-Ethiopian alliance won several battles, the campaign was brutal and costly. In August 1542, Cristóvão da Gama was captured during the Battle of Wafla after a bold but ill-fated maneuver against a numerically superior Adelite force. He was tortured and executed on Ahmad's orders. Despite this setback, his efforts laid the groundwork for later victory. Gama's death galvanized the Ethiopians and reinforced the strategic cooperation between the two Christian powers. Shortly afterward, in 1543, Emperor Gelidus, now leading the resistance, launched a decisive campaign. Using the tactics and firearms learned from the Portuguese and supported by the remaining Portuguese soldiers, he confronted Ahmad Gragn at the Battle of Waina Daga. Ahmed was killed in the battle, and the Idel forces disintegrated, ending their occupation of Ethiopian territory. The intervention of the Portuguese Musketeers played a pivotal role in saving the Ethiopian Empire from collapse. Though small in number, their advanced weaponry and military expertise significantly shifted the balance of power. This episode remains one of the most striking examples of early modern cross-cultural military alliance, where a European power directly intervened in an African conflict not for conquest, but in solidarity with a fellow Christian kingdom. The legacy of this intervention echoes in Ethiopian history as a defining moment of survival and resurgence. Following the death of Ahmad Gragn at the Battle of Waina Daga in 1543, the morale of the Idel Sultanate's army collapsed. Without their charismatic and ruthless leader, the cohesion of their forces disintegrated. Many of the foreign mercenaries and Ottomans applied soldiers who had fought alongside Ahmad retreated, and the remaining Adelite leaders were unable to mount a meaningful resistance against the combined Ethiopian and Portuguese forces. Emperor Gelidus took full advantage of this turning point. He began a campaign to reclaim lost Ethiopian territories, rebuild the shattered empire, and restore the authority of the Solomonic dynasty. Though much of the Ethiopian highlands had been ravaged by years of war and occupation, the emperor pushed forward. bolstered by the symbolic and tactical success of defeating an invading army that had once seemed unstoppable. The few surviving Portuguese Musketeers, who remained after Cristóvão da Gama's death, continued to serve as military advisors and trainers. They were integrated into Ethiopian society to some degree, and their knowledge of firearms became a foundational shift in the way Ethiopian warfare was conducted. Though the Portuguese did not establish a permanent military presence or colony, in Ethiopia, their influence lingered for decades through weapons, tactics, and alliances. Religious ties were also reinforced. The Portuguese saw the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as a sister faith and hoped to bring it closer to the Catholic Church. This created tension, as the Ethiopians valued their religious independence and had deep-rooted traditions that differed from Roman Catholicism. In the decades after the war, Jesuit missionaries arrived in an attempt to convert the empire to Catholicism, which ultimately led to religious strife. However, during the period immediately after the war, the Portuguese were viewed less as religious interlopers and more as saviors. The Portuguese intervention remains one of the earliest instances in sub-Saharan Africa where gunpowder weaponry decisively altered the outcome of a major regional conflict. Ethiopia, though scarred, remained independent, something that distinguished it from most other African kingdoms in the early modern period, many of which would later fall to European imperial powers. The geopolitical consequences were also significant. The collapse of the Adel campaign weakened Ottoman ambitions in the Horn of Africa, where they had hoped to control Red Sea access and dominate trade. The Portuguese, by supporting Ethiopia and pushing back an Ottoman-aligned power, maintained their strategic influence over the Indian Ocean routes. This intervention thus not only preserved a Christian kingdom, but also secured broader Portuguese interests in East Africa. For Ethiopia, the survival of the empire during such a devastating invasion became a core part of its national identity. The alliance with Portugal is remembered not only for the valor of Cristóvão da Gama and his men, but for how it showed the potential of international solidarity in a time of existential danger. The Musketeers' role, small in number, but immense in impact, remains a powerful chapter in both Portuguese and Ethiopian history. In the years that followed the Portuguese intervention, the Ethiopian Empire slowly recovered from the devastation left by the wars. Emperor Gelidus worked tirelessly to stabilize his realm. He re-established royal authority in regions that had either fallen to the Adel Sultanate or descended into local anarchy. The rebuilding process was slow and painful. Villages had been razed, churches looted or destroyed, and entire populations displaced by years of scorched earth warfare. One of Gelidus's most significant acts after the war was to reaffirm the theological independence of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Though grateful to the Portuguese, he resisted pressure from Rome to recognize the Pope's authority over Ethiopian Christianity. He publicly rejected Jesuit calls to convert, even as a small number of Jesuit priests began arriving to push for religious union. His stance helped preserve the unique traditions of the Ethiopian Church, which traced its roots back to the early centuries of Christianity and maintained ties to the Coptic Church of Egypt. However, religious tensions would simmer beneath the surface for decades. After Gelidus's death in 1559, successive emperors would wrestle with the legacy of the Portuguese alliance. Some welcomed further Portuguese and Jesuit presence, while others saw them as a threat to Ethiopian identity. These tensions would eventually explode in the early 17th century under Emperor Susenyos, who converted to Catholicism under Jesuit influence. His decision provoked fierce resistance from his subjects, leading to civil unrest. In 1632, his successor, Emperor Fasilides, reversed the conversion and expelled the Jesuits from Ethiopia, closing the chapter of official Portuguese religious involvement. Despite the later rupture, the military aid Portugal had provided during the 1540s remained an unforgettable moment in Ethiopian memory. The weapons and tactics the Portuguese introduced continued to influence Ethiopian warfare well into the next century. The arquebus, though eventually replaced by newer firearms, symbolized a moment Ethiopia crossed into the age of gunpowder with the help of distant allies. In Portugal, Cristóvão da Gama's sacrifice was romanticized and remembered as an example of Christian heroism. Though his expedition failed to survive intact, his death and the later Ethiopian victory gave his story a near-martyr status. Chronicles and letters describing his campaign circulated in Lisbon and beyond, presenting Ethiopia as a noble Christian kingdom besieged by Islamic forces, an image that fit well into Portuguese imperial and religious narratives of the time. The Ethiopian war and the intervention of the Portuguese Musketeers was more than just a regional conflict. It was a convergence of global forces: Islamic expansionism, backed by the Ottomans, Christian resistance supported by European powers, and the first real clash of early modern weaponry on the African highlands. It stands as one of the earliest examples of international coalition warfare in Africa, where geopolitics, faith, and firearms collided. Centuries later, Ethiopia would again distinguish itself as one of the few African nations to resist colonization, notably defeating the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This spirit of resistance has deep roots in Ethiopian history, but one of its earliest and most dramatic moments came when, on the edge of destruction, an ancient Christian kingdom stood firm with the help of 400 foreign musketeers, turning the tide of history.